The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. It's a real treat when we have one of our favorite guests come back, and we've had enough guests now that we have several favorites. Steve Abrams was so kind a couple of years ago to help sort through the issues with various formulas, and then was kind enough to come back on in 2022 when there were issues with the supply chain. So Steve Abrams, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be back here.
Steve Abrams at Dell Medical School and international expert on all sorts of things related to infant nutrition, has been on all sorts of committees that have looked into and regulated that. So thank you very much for your expertise.
I'm glad to be here.
Do you want to talk about any disclosures?
No disclosures relevant to this.
Well, let's dive right in. So just to remind us, in 2022, there was a major disruption in formula supply, and that has kind of changed the way we look at formula since then. It's interesting because at the time, I think the conversation we had was that there are basically four manufacturers of formulas in the United States. And so we could talk about the four manufacturers. There are more manufacturers in the mix now than there were then.
Absolutely. So what happened is that some of the formulas that were brought in under what we called then fly formula, which was a special FDA category allowing formulas to come in that weren't fully registered and hadn't gone through the full process with the FDA. Now these formulas are mostly on the market permanently. They've either completed or are completing that FDA registration process. So when families go to the store, they're seeing several options that they didn't see before. In addition, we've had several formulas that were either just coming into the marketplace or hadn't yet come into the marketplace, are now on the shelves or available online to become quite popular. So we've gone from 3 to 4 companies really dominating the market to opportunities when you look at the store or online of about a dozen or so companies that are offering routine infant formulas that can be found there fully FDA registered.
It's interesting because I'm the sort of nerdy guy who subscribes to both Consumer Reports and Wirecutter, and I looked at their survey of infant formulas, and leafing through it, it's a lot of information. And I think for parents want to do right by their children. And so sorting through how to choose a formula, I think they both boiled it down to you don't have to make a lot of concessions to make a formula better, that a standard formula is generally the right place to start. But it's still very confusing, I think, for parents as well as for us.
One of the things we've been concerned about that's gotten much worse in the last 4 years, from my perspective, is the advertising of infant formulas and social media. And a lot of that advertising is very confusing and at times marginally misleading. So I think it's important for pediatricians to really be aware of what the issues are. What does it mean if a formula is organic? What does it mean to have oligosaccharides or DHA in formulas and things of that sort? And is it really true that European formulas are better or worse than American produced formulas? Because the marketplace is filled with marketing that's not allowed in many other countries, but is allowed in the United States, and some of it is very confusing.
And those of us of a certain age remember when formulas were only marketed through pediatricians. There was no public marketing, and things have changed.
They have, and it was always a self-regulation of that marketing because the U.S. never signed on to regulations that exist through the World Health Organization about marketing. But ultimately, the companies decided that they didn't want to regulate in that way. And now we see all these newer companies coming on the market, the way they're identifying their formula to the marketplace is by public advertising, and they're using social media, a very unregulated place to get information.
And we'll talk about that at more length in a couple of episodes. Can you explain Operation Stork Speed to us?
Sure. When the shortages occurred, with one company not being able to produce a large amount of their formula, The FDA, along with the White House, said we're going to let formulas that are being used and safely used in other countries into the United States on a temporary basis, and then give them a pathway to be permanently regulated to be used in the United States. So that process, called Operation Stork Speed, opened up the US market to a number of different formulas. Many of them decided to go to a permanent regulatory system, and we're now 4+ years since Operation Stork Speed began. We're seeing that happen, where the formulas that were temporarily on the market are now permanently available in the United States.
Tell us what has changed about import flexibility in the process.
Well, it's a little bit complicated. For those formulas that were under FI formula, not much has changed because they've gone through the usual process. At the time of FI formula, the government did allow personal use of some formulas that were not registered with the FDA and did not go through FI formula. That personal exemption still exists, but we don't recommend it. Those who wish a European-based formula, for whatever reason, or an Australian formula or goat milk-based formula, whatever they might want, they can find that through FDA-registered formulas, and we still recommend that. But it is true that for personal use, the government will not interdict the importation of other formulas that the FDA hasn't registered.
How does that balance the issues of safety with availability?
Well, from my perspective, when there's a problem, so for example, there's a real problem with certain European formulas about 5 months ago, in which they had a toxin that was found in the formulas that was based on a component in the formulas. And that toxin was not found in any US registered formulas, none. But yet, if you had imported one of those formulas, you might have gotten, for personal use, you might have gotten the formulas under the recall, but the FDA wasn't doing a recall on formulas that they didn't register. And so it would have been difficult to sort that out. Now, we don't know that any infants in the United States were harmed, but it points out the idea that anything that you need or your family wants in the formula can be found now in a formula that's fully FDA registered or finishing that process. There's no reason to use some of the formulas that people did in the past just because they wanted a European formula for some reason.
Again, so that I make sure I understand. So when there are problems with, say, a European formula, most of the imported formulas are either European or Australian, right?
There's some from New Zealand, but
And from
mostly.
okay, when there's a problem with the European formula, if it's imported through the channels where they're registered with the FDA, then the FDA would let us know if there was a problem.
Right. Any recall or anything would be fully coordinated with the FDA. And the FDA would be leading the messaging, and they would be communicating with the retail outlets. But when you have formulas that are not registered, they're being imported for individual use. They're not going through the big stores because they can't do that. So
And
it's just been brought in through these side dealerships, and they're not subject to FDA regulation as readily.
and consumers may not be aware then when there's even a recall of a European formula.
That's possible. But again, I tell people, if families want that European formula, if you go to the stores and you look, and I'm going to give you, for your listeners later on, a website they can go to. There's now a FDA updated list of all the formulas that they've registered for use in the United States. We got that for the first time about a month ago after demanding it for years, the list, and I'm going to make sure your viewers have that link for it.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful. Moving beyond that, then, let's talk about some of the safety concerns that there have been with formula. You alluded to the notion that both in Europe and in the United States, we've had issues with contaminated formulas. Tell us about that. How does that happen?
So there's recalls due to contamination, bacterial, viral, whatever might be there, other agents have always existed. We had a really important recall that occurred in the United States late last year of what formula, and this is, although I don't use formula names in this case because it was recalled, I do use it,
Sure.
which is a formula called Byheart. And it had a problem in which literally there was botulism cases that were reported from it. And people are still investigating the exact source. We have a pretty good idea what happened, but there's no final verdict on it. But nonetheless, a whole series of about 50 babies were actually hospitalized with infant botulism. And it was a major problem. So we know that those kind of concerns occasionally exist, and that the recall process, although it's effective, at times communicating about recalls can be challenging.
It's my understanding that the powdered formulas are typically more at risk for contamination than the liquid formulas.
That's true because the powder cannot be sterilized for standard sterilization. But liquid formulas are much more expensive. They're not widely used, for example, outside the United States at all. And they're largely used in the NICU and in specialized circumstances. So over 90% of the US formula supply and close to 100% of the non-US formula supply is powder. So we don't really have a way to get around powder, and some of the contamination issues can still occur with liquid as well. But it's generally true that when using powder, you have to pay attention to CDC and FDA guidance for safe preparation. And this is particularly important in the first 6 to 8 weeks of life.
And remind us of what the most important points there are.
The FDA and CDC have a written website to tell you about boiling and cooling, and I won't try to go through those here
Okay.
because I think it's best for families to read them. They're briefly placed on the label. The most important thing to know is make sure the place in which you're preparing powder formula is really clean, because you can have all the guidelines in the world, but bacteria and things can exist on your countertops and things of that sort. So a real attention to cleanliness is more important than anything else.
Tell us about some other safety concerns with formulas. Talk about heavy metals in formulas.
There's been a lot of interest really over the last year to 2 years in heavy metal contamination of our food supply, including the food supply that's provided to infant small children, going beyond infant formula, including baby foods and things of that sort. There's a variety of concerns that exist. It's typically historical concern, of course, was lead that might exist environmentally. Now we have concerns about arsenic and mercury, as well as some other ones like cadmium, but arsenic and mercury are probably the two main ones. These heavy metals can cause neurocognitive problems, but we don't entirely know what the safe level is. They are ubiquitous. They exist in ground soil. It's nearly impossible to absolutely get them out, but we're really beginning to understand that we need to be paying attention to those, and government as well as industry need to be monitoring those levels in all infant products, not just formula, to make sure that those levels are monitored and as low as possible.
And ironically, in an era where children were led through rice cereal after weaning, rice cereal itself can have arsenic
Yeah,
presence because rice
right.
grows in soil.
Right. But that doesn't mean that you can never give your baby a rice-based product. And that's where we have this kind of sophisticated level of understanding that a mixed diet, especially if we're talking about older children, infants here, not in the first couple months of life where they're just getting formula or breast milk, but that for older infants, that it's okay. You don't want to necessarily take all of the rice cereal out of their diet, but that mixing the foods that you give them will decrease the amount. So it is an area that the FDA is focusing on a lot. There was a report in Consumer Reports, Consumer Union put out about the levels of some of these things, and infant formula caused a lot of concern. And the concern's important, but people may have overread it and may have thought that meant you had to stop using any formula they named, but that's not true.
What can you tell me about the Closer to Zero project?
So people in Congress have really been pushing the FDA to establish clear standards for infant products, including formula, for what the level is of these heavy metals and other contaminants, pesticides, and all sorts of things. Again, recognizing that these are absolutely ubiquitous contaminants in nature, you cannot get to absolute zero. But we can get very low levels to the point where there's little, if any, concern about safety. And the goal of the FDA has been to establish setting standards that bring them down. And the way that's done is by mixing the source by which you get them, close monitoring of batches. So if one batch has high levels of arsenic, then it's discarded, that kind of stuff. So the FDA has been working on this process. It kind of is peaked in attention, and I expect within the next month to 2 months, there'll be more information coming out from the FDA about this. So it's something for pediatricians to pay attention to, but also to be aware of so that they don't get the conclusion that what's being said is, oh my gosh, you can't use formula. Because then what happens is people make homemade formulas that have way more contaminants in them and are way less safe.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, as I was preparing for our chats and doing a little bit of a deep dive into formulas, it's fascinating to me that there seems to be an upsurge in people recommending making your own formula at home, the old evaporated milk and whatever else you add to it, which seems like a disastrous compromise.
It's a terrible idea. And unfortunately, we do live in an internet age where people can make beautiful videos showing how they mix it up. And
Yeah.
then people confusingly bring back pictures from the 1950s when I was a baby. And sure enough, I was on evaporated milk formulas, but they didn't tell you that some of those babies got sick from that stuff. And those evaporated milk formulas were not ideal. That's never the solution. Never, ever the solution. But nonetheless, it's been hard to really stamp down because we live in a world in which people can fearmonger. And if I can give you a fearmongering example, it's seed oils. So maybe take a little
Yeah.
divergence here.
Yeah.
So you heard about a year ago this panic that, oh my gosh, formulas have seed oils, feed seed oils are bad for babies. What you didn't hear is that every single formula used in the whole world has seed oils in them, or similar fruit and vegetable oils in them. And that these things have never been shown to have any negative health harms in babies. And so you get this stuff, and you can find Instagram videos and TikTok and all this kind of stuff telling you, oh my gosh, the seed oils are causing horrible diseases. Not the slightest infant. Seed oils have been used literally a couple million babies a year for about the last 60 years. You can multiply that out yourself without a single known complication related to seed oils.
Yeah. We'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks, but I think one of the things that almost everything we do in medicine is complicated by these days is what the author Tom Nichols wrote about as the death of expertise, that we've democratized information to an extent that I think many of us are challenged in finding trusted sources, and instead our trusted sources don't know a lot more about it than we do.
One of the problems is that we are, as pediatricians, really strong advocates of breastfeeding and breast milk. No
Yes.
question about the health benefits of that. But yet we know that the majority of babies in the United States will at some time get an infant formula.
Mm-hmm.
We could spend all day talking about why that is, and probably others that you've had on to talk about social issues that lead to that. But the pediatrician is the person that people go to say, I need to use, or I choose to use an infant formula. What should I use? And if the pediatrician has only been trained in supporting breastfeeding, as important as that is, then they have trouble getting that information. So that's why we're talking, and that's why we're trying to sort through these things. Because the reality is that families are confused by social media, by false claims, both in terms of the seed oil kind of things, as well as this formula costs twice as much as the next formula. That means it's twice as good.
Well, and the other thing I think is difficult for us to navigate, and we'll sort of wind up this episode on this thought, is that the information that we have, it's difficult, I think, for us to find trusted sources. And so looking at a few years ago, when I reached out to you and asked if you would come on and talk about it, it's difficult because a lot of the information we get comes from the manufacturers as opposed to somebody, and that's why I'm so grateful that you've been willing to come back on, someone who studies this from outside manufacturer's point of view.
It's hard because the reality is that it's hard to get research funding if you're a young scientist that's pure, that doesn't come from some corporate considerations or sources. So there's not a lot of people that have maintained the type of independent expertise. And of course, not everyone that takes money or does work or gives talks related to infant formula is necessarily going to be biased. One has to make sure that those things are disclosed. But the reality is that the number of independent experts on infant formula, especially those for full-term babies as opposed to preterm babies, is fairly limited.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much. There's been a lot to think about here. Any other advice about how we can best stay informed about what's going on with formulas?
I think the most important thing, and we'll talk about this some more, is to find out where your parents are getting their source from. If they
Okay.
come to you and say, this is what I heard, that I can't give my baby a seed oil containing formula because it's going to cause who knows what, where did you see that? What's that person's expertise?
Right.
Yeah, it's the same analogous to the anti-vaccine stuff. Where did you get that information from? What's the reliability of that kind of information? And we have to systematically find out where they're getting that information and take it apart where it's not accurate.
Perfect. Well, Steve, thanks for your time and expertise. We'll look forward to talking to you again next week. To our listeners, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in a few days. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Thanks to Phil Wirkus, who composed the theme music. See you next time.